After my boyfriend lost his memory, he insisted that I was his stepmother. His wealthy father paid me $30 million to play along and help him regain his memory. Later, he finally remembered. He came to me with red eyes, saying, "Sister, you promised to love me forever." His father coldly closed the door and said calmly, "There is no distinction between big and small. Your mother didn't sleep well last night, let her rest." When Richard and I first got together, he mentioned having a complicated family. Laughable, can there be an uncomplicated family among the wealthy? At that time, I only thought about pursuing him, so I just nodded absent-mindedly. No matter how complicated, it won't stop me from running to you without hesitation. Richard was deeply moved and immediately agreed to be my boyfriend. Then the next day, he had an accident and lost his memory. When the hospital called me, I was still chatting with my girlfriend in the bar. Do you know what's the hardest thing in the world? Diamonds? No, it's being 18. Before I could finish my sentence, my phone on the table suddenly rang. I answered the call, and a strange male voice came through, amidst the noise of the bar's music, oddly pleasant. "Is this Shirley?" With a hint of depth in his voice, he continued, "Please come to the city center hospital as soon as possible. Richard has had an accident." My new boyfriend, less than 24 hours in hand, had an accident. I rushed to the hospital, found the ward where Richard was staying, his forehead bandaged, and several cuts on his youthful and handsome face. Standing beside the hospital bed was a man approximately 1.9 meters tall, elegantly dressed in a suit, with a stern demeanor. Upon hearing the commotion, Richard looked up at me and said, "Mom, you're here." I couldn't believe it. "What did you call me?" "Mom." He frowned at Shirley, looking at me with confusion. "What's wrong with you?" I was filled with anger, about to roll up my sleeves and confront him, when the man standing by the bedside finally moved. He raised his hand to stop me, then gestured to Shirley. "Miss Shirley, let's step outside and talk." The man wore a wristwatch worth millions, likely a Patek Philippe. He appeared to be in his early 30s, his hair meticulously styled, his face quite handsome. With a high bridge nose, slightly pursed lips, his eyes carried an inexplicable scrutiny and coldness when looking at me. After closing the door of the ward, standing in the hospital corridor, he informed me that Richard, due to the impact on his head from the accident, was now confused and mistook me for his stepmother. I asked, "How should I address you?" He replied, "Calvin." I nodded understandingly. "Got it. Are you Richard's brother?" "No, I'm his father." With a bang, it was as if lightning struck me. Shocked, I stared at him. "Are you kidding me? Richard is only 18 this year, and you look around 30, now you are telling me you are his father?" Calvin Shirley frowned, and I noticed a slight resemblance between him and Richard. "Miss Shirley, let me correct two things. Richard is not my biological son, but we do have a blood relation. Also, he is not 18 but 16. Everything went dark before my eyes. If it hadn't been for Richard's accident tonight, wouldn't I be embarking on a path of illegal activities this weekend? In the hospital's cafe on the first floor, Calvin and I sat face to face. It was a private hospital, with exorbitant fees. Even the coffee prices were outrageous. I ordered an iced Americano casually, and the price was over $100. After taking a sip, I grimaced, almost spitting it out. It was more bitter than my fate. Sitting across from me, Calvin calmly reiterated, "In any case, the doctor said Richard's injuries are severe this time. Creating an environment consistent with his memory will help with his recovery. I hope Miss Shirley can cooperate with me." I chuckled. "Mr. Calvin's fatherly love is touching. It's just unfortunate that just a minute ago, I had already decided to break up with Richard." "Are you kidding me? I'm only 25 this year. Why should I become a stepmother to my almost legal adult ex-boyfriend?" I stood up to leave, but Calvin didn't move, just calmly said behind me, "$30 million. My steps abruptly halted, and I turned to look at him. "Dollars?" "Yes." "I don't believe it. Put it in writing." And then Calvin really called his lawyer. Right there in the hospital cafe, a contract was drawn up in front of me. The contract stated that if I lived with him as a married couple for 3 years and helped Richard regain his memory, I would receive $30 million as compensation. He would pay an initial $10 million, and after 3 years, regardless of Richard's recovery, he would settle the remaining $20 million. After signing, Calvin immediately transferred $10 million to me. I counted the zeros twice, tears welling up as I put away my phone. Mr. Calvin, please instruct me as you wish. Calvin stood up, reminding me plainly, Miss Shirley, from now on, you need to change your way of addressing me. I complied readily, sure, dear husband, no problem. Shall we go see our son now? 3 days later, Richard was discharged from the hospital. I packed my things and moved into the family's detached villa near the city center with them. At first glance, Calvin seemed familiar, and after some thought, I finally remembered he had been featured as an outstanding young entrepreneur in the financial magazine of the city. I never imagined that one day I would be in such a relationship with him. Along the way, Richard held onto my arm tightly, whispering, Mom, you need to keep an eye on my dad. If you can't stop him from being with other women, at least don't let him transfer marital assets. Mom knows. I affectionately ran my hand through my good big son's hair, feeling a mix of emotions. Just 3 days ago, I had been daydreaming about scenarios that shouldn't be imagined, where he and I were the main characters. The next moment, he was 2 years younger. I skipped a generation. Can't think about it anymore. On the second night of living in the villa, I moved into Calvin's room. The warm yellow light inside the room illuminated his face as he sat at the desk, flipping through a book. I glanced at the book briefly. It had a few obscure, unfamiliar terms in the title, probably something related to economics. Seeing the blanket in my hands, Calvin raised an eyebrow and set down the book in his hands. Miss Shirley, we are just pretending, you don't have to go to such lengths. I took a deep breath and replied sharply, do you think I want to? I never discuss men older than me. Richard kept asking me all night if our relationship is bad because we're sleeping in separate rooms. I couldn't answer him. In Richard's confused memory, I was the only stepmom he accepted. Calvin, however, was charming and unfaithful. His wealthy girlfriends all wanted to move up in the world and take my place. Towards the end, his eyes turned red and he looked at me stubbornly. Mom, no matter how unfaithful my father is, I only recognize you. What a good kid, such a pity. Calvin rubbed his forehead, nodded, and said, got it, I'll give you the bed. I rolled a few times on the bed with the blanket in my arms and fell asleep. When I woke up, it was already bright outside. Rubbing my sleepy eyes, I yawned and went to the bathroom. As soon as I opened the door, I bumped into Calvin. His clothes were disheveled, his hair dripping with water, even droplets hung from his eyelashes. Just waking up, my brain was a bit slow. My gaze slowly moved down until I saw his abs, before I reacted. Calvin looked at me with a mysterious expression in his eyes. I felt like he was waiting for some exaggerated reaction from me, just to achieve his goal. So, I smiled, raised my hand to grab his shoulder, and teasingly blinked, honey, not going to the office today? Calvin looked at me without moving. I continued to tease him, with my fingertips damp from the water, slid from his shoulder down to his chest. Want to give it a try, fake it for real? Calvin smirked, then suddenly picked me up and threw me onto the bed. I sat up immediately, glaring at him warily. Calvin, this is a different price. He stood by the bed, looking down at me, lips slightly curved. Miss Shirley, I am not interested in my son's girlfriend. This round was a tie. Calvin dried his hair, changed his clothes in the adjacent dressing room, and resumed his noble and aloof demeanor. When you're free, remember to accept my friend request. With these words, Calvin left without even looking back. I sat on the bed for a while, picked up my phone, and indeed there was a new friend request. After accepting it, Calvin sent me a group chat link without saying a word. Surprisingly, it was the parent group of Richard's school. There's a parent meeting tonight, I have clients here, can't make it, can you go instead? Stood in front of Richard's classroom, I felt a mix of emotions. I met him near the university basketball court in the community. At that time, he lied and told me he was 18, a freshman in college. Now, the kid is in his senior year. Mom! Richard greeted me enthusiastically and rushed over. My seat was there with my name on the desk. But as soon as I sat down, a socialite with an Hermes bag hanging off her shoulder beside me spoke up. You're Richard's mother? Yes, I replied. She said with a fake smile, you look quite young. As I flipped through Richard's severely skewed exam paper, I casually replied, stepmom. The parent meeting ended an hour and a half later. I fell behind a few steps as I left and overheard her gossiping with another socialite. Looks like she's only a few years older than the child. She keeps everyone in check so obediently, quite cunning. Yeah, maybe we should complain to the teacher. It's uncomfortable sitting next to a woman like her at the parent meeting. Looks like she's troublesome. Clearly, they were talking about me. I forced a smile, picked up my canvas bag, squeezed past the two of them as they grumbled, "Excuse me." In their annoyed calls, I turned back, revealing a sly smile. "You two should take better care of yourselves. Maybe in 2 years, the girlfriend your son brings home might just be me." And then, I floated away amidst their astonished and angry looks. It was drizzling outside. Richard had already gone home ahead of me. I took out my phone and saw a call from my bestie Jenny. "Shirley, where have you been all this time? Haven't talked to me for a week. Did you get married?" She always liked to joke around, but this time she was oddly accurate. I hailed a taxi, opened the door, and got in. "Yes." "Kidding, what's up?" "Your boyfriend is only 18, not even at the legal marriage age set by the country. And with his dad." This time, even the well-informed Jenny fell silent. After a deathly quiet moment, she hung up directly. Then, she sent a location of a bar, meet for an explanation. I gave the address to the cab driver, closed the window slightly to feel the cool rain on my face. I had motion sickness, so when I entered the bar, my stomach still had a faint discomfort. Sitting in a booth, I quickly told her the story, and at the end, showed her the 8-figure number in my bank account. Calvin was even more handsome than his son, but he was too old, violating my principle of only dating younger men. Jenny looked shocked. "What an incredible experience. Can we still flirt with handsome guys together in the future?" I picked up my glass, downed the whole drink in one gulp. "As long as Calvin doesn't find out, there shouldn't be a problem, right?" Suddenly, the light in front of me dimmed. I looked up and met a familiar handsome face, his expression still indifferent, but his eyes were filled with an inexplicable chill. "Miss Shirley, since you've taken the money, I hope you can at least abide by the contract a bit." The alcohol made my brain sluggish and my body heavy. Looking at Calvin's deadpan face, I blurted out, "The contract only states that we're married. It doesn't say we can't have affairs, right?" Unfortunately, the music in the bar came to a stop at that moment, and my voice, raised slightly due to drunkenness, echoed throughout the entire bar. As all eyes turned towards me, Jenny sat across from me, silently put on a mask to cover her face. Calvin's lips twitched slightly at the corners as he bent down, picked me up, and hung my torn canvas bag on his arm. Before leaving, he turned to Jenny and said, "She's drunk, so I'll take her home first." I curled up in the passenger seat beside Calvin, feeling his smooth driving skills, and suddenly realized something. I only get motion sickness, not Lamborghini sickness. The car was quiet, with only a faint smell of alcohol lingering. I shifted to a more comfortable position and asked Calvin, "Didn't you have a client you couldn't leave?" "How come you're at the bar?" "After finishing the business deal and preparing to leave, I saw you getting off the car and entering the bar, so I followed." My vision went black. "How much of my conversation with my friend did you hear?" As we approached a red light, he pressed the brake, placed a hand on the steering wheel, turned to look at me, and said with a slight smirk, "Everything." I closed my eyes in despair, pretending to be drunk, and unknowingly fell asleep. When we got home, Richard was still awake. He was sitting on the couch playing games, and when he saw Calvin helping me in, he hurried over. "Dad, did you upset Mom?" "Why would she go drinking to drown her sorrows?" Calvin calmly replied, "Your mom is happy. Today at the parents' meeting, your teacher specifically praised you for making great progress." "Really?" Richard asked in disbelief. Calvin nodded. "Go to bed early, play fewer games. This is a crucial year, you can't slack off." He helped me upstairs, turned into the corridor, where Richard couldn't see. I suddenly opened my eyes, grabbed his wrist, and pressed him against the wall. With a hint of drunkenness in my voice, I said, "Honey." Calvin looked down at me. Today, when I went to the parents' meeting, other parents all said I was the mistress who overthrew their husband. I smiled, tilted my chin up, and leaned closer to him. "You know what? When I first met your son, that's how I flirted with him. I thought Calvin would coldly push me away. But in the warm yellow light of the corridor, his eyes darkened, and instead, he held my chin, preparing to lower his head to kiss me. There came a series of footsteps approaching. Ultimately, that kiss didn't land, it merely brushed gently along the side of my face. Calvin gently pressed my head against his shoulder, turned to look at a bewildered Richard, and said, "She's not feeling well after drinking too much. I'm just going to rest here with her for a while." Richard nodded and continued upstairs. I stifled a laugh against Calvin's shoulder, saying, "That was close." "I almost kissed your son's ex-girlfriend in front of him, huh?" He straightened my head, with a hint of warning in his tone. "Shirley, don't play these games." Despite my average tolerance for alcohol, I have a clear memory of what happened when I drink too much. So, the next day when I woke up and remembered flirting with Calvin under the influence of alcohol, I wanted to bid farewell to this beautiful world. He seemed completely unconcerned, fixed his tie, turned to look at me nestled under the covers, and said, "Shirley." I smiled coyly, "Mr. Calvin, what can I do for you?" Calvin furrowed his brow slightly. "If you have any plans next Friday evening, please cancel or postpone them. We are going to take Richard back home." Concerned about staying overnight, I stayed at home in the following days, clutching my laptop and typing furiously. During this time, Jenny called. "How was it, Shirley? What happened after your husband took you home that day? What could have happened?" It's hard to say for sure. Although I haven't seen Calvin interacting with any other woman besides me. But Richard's confused memories must have some basis in reality. In the afternoon, I picked up Richard from school, and then the driver drove us to a mansion located in the suburbs. I had never seen such a luxurious residence in my life. Detecting my nervousness and unease, Richard reached out and held my hand, saying, "Mom, don't worry. If anyone dares to trouble you, I'll fight back." As we entered the living room, I was dazzled by the array of people in front of me. And the most eye-catching figure among them was Calvin standing in the center. It was a bit warm inside, and he took off his suit jacket, revealing a silver-gray pinstripe shirt underneath. A young and pretty woman was standing beside him, with exquisite curls and wearing a light silver satin dress, smiling and talking to him, looking very compatible. Upon hearing some movement, Calvin's gaze swept towards us. When he saw me and Richard holding hands, his expression turned cold. But Richard squeezed my hand tighter and said, "Mom, it's that woman. She claims to be childhood sweethearts with Dad, wanting to kick you out of your place now." Childhood sweethearts? Now, this caught my interest. I had intended to watch a little emotional drama from my spot, but Richard dragged me over there and called out coldly, "Dad." Before Calvin could respond, the woman by his side spoke gently, "Richard is here today too?" "Richard, this is my home, why can't I come?" The woman's expression stiffened. Calvin's gaze landed on my face, seemingly with a hidden meaning. After a moment, he spoke affectionately, "Shirley, come here." I was surprised, but obediently walked over, allowing him to lead me as he introduced me to the important relatives of the family. One of the women, adorned in gold and silver, smiled and said, "Calvin, why didn't you mention her before? Isn't this the first time you've brought Miss Shirley home? If she's going to be our daughter-in-law, she at least needs the old lady's approval, right?" Calvin casually smirked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Dear sister-in-law, you jest. Richard and I don't live here, we seldom come back. As my wife, Shirley only needs my approval, others' opinions are irrelevant." To prove our strong relationship, he placed his hand on my shoulder, sliding it down my back along the curve, ultimately enveloping my waist. He bent slightly, as if whispering, and said softly, "Come closer." I leaned against him, coyly saying, "Honey, Richard has been studying hard, he said he's hungry on the way here." "When are we dining?" The elder son from across the table sent me approving glances. With our large family, by the end of the meal, I hadn't even managed to recognize everyone, but I had enjoyed free viewing of a high society drama, sipping on red wine. Their attitude towards Calvin was obviously distant and wary, especially when mentioning Richard. Calvin's elder brother and sister-in-law looked particularly uncomfortable. I also found out the name of the silver-skirted beauty, Mia, who is a close friend of their family. It was clear that they wanted to match her with Calvin. In fact, when they were kids, Calvin and Mia were the best of friends. The sister-in-law put down her chopsticks and began to reminisce, saying, "These two kids were so close back then, for sure the two families were going to be in-laws in the future, but who would have thought?" Mia interrupted with a smile, "Richard, when did you get married? I don't seem to have received a wedding invitation." Calvin remained calm. He picked up a sweet shrimp and placed it in my plate, then helped me tuck some loose hair behind my ear. Shirley, being simple-minded, I simply followed her lead, so we had a simple wedding. Thinking back to how I reacted to the 30 million, I suddenly felt guilty, so I quickly peeled the shrimp, trying to please Calvin, and put it back in his bowl. On the other side, Richard's voice turned cold. Why would I have to apologize to her? My mom takes care of me in every way at home, and as a return, you mess around with women like her outside, causing her trouble, is that it? After saying this, he angrily walked out, and I hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow him. The autumn night wind was chilly, and I was trembling because I didn't have a coat. Richard. He turned to look at me and stopped, then took off his school uniform jacket and put it on me, apologizing in a muffled voice. Sorry, Mom, did I cause you trouble again? I patted his head. It's okay, I believe your dad can handle it. Sitting by the fountain in the garden, the jacket still retained the warmth of the young man. Richard, with a slightly lowered head, sounding a bit sad, said, Mom, if my dad really mistreats you, just divorce him. How can you stand it? There are still 2 million we haven't collected. He's actually pretty good to me. I racked my brains and decided to fabricate the story of how good he was to me one night when I had a stomach ache. He came to bring me medicine in the rain, and there was another time when we went hiking, I sprained my ankle, and he carried me down the mountain. The protagonists of these two events were actually me and Richard, but he lost his memory now. So, when I mentioned it, he just blankly responded, Oh, I see. I nodded, continued to make up stories. So, Calvin, your dad isn't that bad after all. Those outside are hotels, the two of us, we are his true family. As I finished speaking and looked up, the man was standing just steps away, looking down at us. Calvin said, Shall we go? Are you not staying at the house tonight? With just one glance from his eyes, I suddenly remembered that I was still wearing Richard's jacket. Feeling inexplicably guilty, I quickly took it off and returned it to Richard. Richard might not remember, but both Calvin and I were very aware of the existence of that love affair. Even if it only lasted for a short day. No need, let's go home, Calvin said, taking the lead towards the garage. Then he remembered something and took off his suit jacket to give to me. Just wear this if you're feeling cold. A faint woody aroma came from the suit, completely different from the clear youthfulness. I was silent for 2 seconds, pursed my lips, and decisively put it on. Back home, Richard went to sleep, and I fiddled with the computer for a while, feeling restless. Unable to write anything, I decided to grab a can of wine from the refrigerator and slip out into the yard. That's when I noticed Calvin was also there. As our eyes met, I raised the beer can in my hand. Will I be charged extra for this? It was obviously a stupid question because Calvin didn't bother to respond. He looked at me quietly for a moment and suddenly said, I thought you would ask me about Richard and our family. I'm just here to handle money. I shouldn't ask about things I'm not supposed to ask. I get it, Calvin said with a hint of sarcasm. You're suddenly so compliant with the contract, it's a bit unusual for me. I thought you might ask me about Richard and our family, Calvin continued, glancing at me. I just handle money matters. If I'm not supposed to ask, then I won't ask about this. I understand. His lips slightly curled. It is strange to suddenly see you follow the rules. I smiled, threw away the flattened beer can, and walked over, leaning down on the back of Calvin's chair. Did you hear everything that night? Shaking my head regretfully, I sighed. What a pity, Calvin, you're so good-looking that I can hardly resist breaking my principles for you. We were so close that his clear eyes seemed like a lake under the moonlight. In the next second of eye contact, he suddenly lifted his hand, cupped the back of my head, and with a slight force, our lips touched. Let's break it then. His voice was deeper and more husky than usual, as if casting a spell that set everything out of control. The night breeze softly blew in, bringing a sprinkling of coolness, but it did not alleviate the burning sensation. The smell of alcohol on me, and the solid woody scent on him, gradually intertwined, blending into each other. Calvin's Adam's apple moved, his voice hoarse. Surely. Go back to the room. I smiled, lowered my head, letting the hair fall lightly, and said on purpose, Don't be so cautious, Richard is already asleep upstairs and wouldn't hear. Because the next second, I heard the familiar voice come from behind, Mom. Turning around, I saw the deep emotions in the boy's once bright eyes. Aside from the sleepiness, there seemed to be some other unspoken feelings. I slowly stood up, trying to change my expression from affection to tenderness. Are you awake? Had a nightmare? Richard stared at my face for a long time before saying, I'm hungry, come down and get me something to eat. I rubbed my face. It's cold, don't stand at the door, come in and I'll make you a snack. Before entering the house, I looked back. Calvin was still sitting on the bench in the yard, but at some point, he had picked up the beer can I had thrown away. He looked at me, his usual indifference restored. As though the confused and amorous emotions from before were just a momentary mistake. I pursed my lips, looking away, walked steadily into the kitchen, and cooked a bowl of instant noodles for Richard, adding 2 poached eggs. He ate in silence, an unusual scene, saying nothing. Calvin walked in from outside, casually passing us by, not looking upstairs. Sitting opposite Richard, smelling the aroma, I suddenly felt hungry, so I decided to cook a bowl for myself too. However, as I just stood up, Richard suddenly reached out and grabbed my arm. Are you going to see my dad again? No, I'm not. I hesitated, watching a hint of confusion flash in Richard's eyes, then gradually furrow his brows as if sensing some kind of pain, and finally released my arm. Richard? Do you remember something? Richard? The young man slowly opened his eyes, looked at me, and gently shook his head. The next day, Calvin went on a business trip. Then for many days in a row, he was basically out early and back late, nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't think much of it. Until one day when he had just told me in the morning that he was going to meet a client, and in the afternoon, Jenny and I went out, only to catch sight of him shopping with a woman. Jenny was the first to notice. She quickly nudged me. Shirley, isn't that your husband over there in Hermes? I looked up, and sure enough, it was Calvin. Standing next to him, facing the mirror and gesturing towards a golden brown handbag, was Mia. In an instant, I suddenly understood. He was avoiding me. It was Richard who mistook the person. Acting was his idea. I had only ever lacked money. When had I ever lacked a man? I looked coldly as Calvin paid the bill, and he and Mia walked out of the store, each carrying a bag, disappearing from view. After dinner, Jenny received a message from her new boyfriend to go see a performance at the Live House. I was upset, so I went to the bar I had been to last time, ordered a drink, and leaned against the bar, smoking a cigarette. After just 2 drinks, a man in a suit suddenly approached me, snapping his fingers as if he thought he was very handsome. This drink is on me. I didn't want to pay attention to him, but he followed me, annoyed. What are you pretending for, coming here to hook men, thinking you're some innocent girl? Already feeling very irritable, I splashed the drink in his face, sneering, when hooking men, you also have to consider quality. Ugly people are not welcome, so go away. The man became angry, raised his hand to hit me. But before he could strike, his hand was firmly held in midair. The light shone down, revealing Calvin's face. As cold as if it could freeze. The man winced in pain, let go of me. Calvin didn't release his grip, he even held on tighter. In the same suit, it looked very tasteful on him, the cuffs of his shirt rolled up, his wrist bones protruding, the muscles of his forearms particularly beautiful. When he finally let go, the man was already sweating profusely. He didn't even get to say anything harsh, and ran off in embarrassment. Calvin slightly lowered his head, looking at me. Let's go home. I followed behind Calvin, getting into his Lamborghini. As soon as we got in, he spoke, his voice icy. Shirley, since we signed a contract, I hope you can show a little contractual spirit. The contract only said to play the role of a loving couple. As long as Richard doesn't find out, it's fine. I retorted sarcastically, just like when you took Mia shopping. Did you see me with her? I didn't answer. Actually, according to the routine of your prestigious marriage, Mia is the fiancée chosen for you by the Calvin's family, right? Calvin fell silent for 2 seconds. That was indeed the plan before. Mr. Calvin, I'm 25 now. I have needs that adults should have. Since you have concerns, I don't plan to force it, so let's just do our own thing, okay? Calvin suddenly slammed on the brakes, stopping the car on the side of the road. He unfastened his seatbelt, leaned over, straight into my eyes. Shirley, don't. Don't what? I provocatively raised my eyebrows at him. Don't seduce you? Don't come out to hook men? Or don't what? The rest of the words couldn't be said. Because Calvin's lips pressed against mine, silencing all my words. I had been drinking, but he hadn't. It was always like this. I only dared to provoke him when I was drunk, but he remained sober. In the quiet car, a phone rang. Calvin glanced at it whenever he could, and when he saw Richard's name on the caller ID, he suddenly regained his composure. He answered the call, his expression quickly turning cold and icy, like a drawn sword. I frowned and asked, "What happened?" He hung up the phone, looked deeply into my eyes. "Richard's in trouble. Richard's been kidnapped. The ransom they want is 10 times what you're paid." I couldn't even dream of that much money, but Calvin remained calm. "Fine, but I want to make sure he's unharmed." He hung up, immediately called the police, then called his secretary to prepare cash, and instructed the shareholders to prepare for a meeting. As I watched beside him, I suddenly felt something was wrong. Before Calvin left, I reached out to stop him. "Richard will be fine, right?" "Yes." "You foresaw this, right?" Calvin didn't respond. He looked at me with an inscrutable expression, his usually indifferent and calm eyes suddenly sharp, then quickly concealed. He raised his hand, lightly rubbed the top of my head. "Wait for me to come home. There's no such good thing in the world, acting out a loving couple scenario and getting 30 million, almost equal to the income of a celebrity." In the following days, I witnessed Calvin's elder brother and sister-in-law suddenly coming out, accusing him of taking over their nephew's property through adoption. Then Calvin's company's stock price plummeted and rebounded. He presented evidence to the police, proving that the couple had hired someone to kidnap Richard in order to cut off his cash flow. In the midst of chaos, Mia's family issued a statement, stating that she would soon be marrying Calvin. That evening, as I sat at the dining table eating instant noodles, Calvin came back. There was a hint of weariness in his cold eyes, as he looked at me in the golden red light streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling window. "Richard's memory has returned." I nodded, finished the last bite of noodles, drank the remaining soup from the bowl, wiped my mouth, and stood up. "I've already packed my bags early. Don't forget to transfer the remaining 2 million to my account." "Surely. Mr. Calvin, shouldn't a useful pawn be worth that price?" I smiled and said, "Don't play stingy. I may not have money or power, but in the age of the internet, if pushed, I'll leak that contract to all the gossip bloggers and marketing accounts on the web." Calvin pursed his lips, squared his jawline, and remained silent, only staring at me intently. I could tell that his shallow and materialistic demeanor had left an indelible impression on him. I went back to my room, dragged out my suitcase, and left their house. Calvin didn't come after me. A few days later, 2 transfers were made to my bank account, totaling 30 million. That was 1/3 more than the amount agreed upon in the contract. I figured it was probably hush money. So the next day, I dragged Jenny to see some houses in a nearby new residential area. She gave me a mischievous suggestion. "With so much money, why not just buy a villa and get it all in one go?" "Are you kidding me? You know how at Calvin's house, 2 maids are needed to clean the villa every day?" As I said this, I suddenly drifted off. I somehow thought of the beginning of last month. The maid had cleaned the glass door too brightly, and I bumped into it, with a bang, falling to the floor with a throbbing head. A big bump swelled up on my forehead. Coincidentally, Calvin came back from work and saw me like that, hesitated for a moment, then came over to help me up. On his face, which usually showed little emotion, there was a rare hint of helplessness. He asked me to sit at the dining table, got the medicine kit, dipped a cotton swab in the anti-inflammatory and bruise-healing solution, and applied it to the swollen area. The icy touch on my forehead made me squint, tilt my head back, and gaze at Calvin's beautifully sculpted jawline. Suddenly, I reached out and grabbed his wrist. "Be gentle, it hurts," I said in a low, hoarse voice, sounding almost coquettish and unclear, as if teasing. The atmosphere in the dining room slid into uncontrollable ambiguity under the warm yellow light. Calvin paused for a moment, looked down at me with his eyes, and his Adam's apple moved up and down once, showing signs of being moved. Unfortunately, nothing happened. He put away the medicine kit, told me to rest early, then went into the study and didn't return to the bedroom all night. However, the next morning, I found 2 decorative stickers on the sliding glass door in the kitchen, ensuring I would never mistake it again and bump into it accidentally. The maid said that Mr. Calvin had specifically ordered it before he went out in the morning. "Surely?" Jenny's voice brought me back to reality. I replied, let's go check out another property." In the end, I settled on an 80 square meter 2-bedroom apartment. It was not too big for one person to live in, with a view of the man-made lake in the distance outside the window. On the other side of the lake was where Calvin's villa was located. As we left the sales office, the sky was darkening and snowflakes were falling sparsely outside. Jenny suddenly hesitated and said, "Shirley, you seem not very happy." "How is that possible?" I laughed and blew hot air onto my cold fingertips. "I've been acting for 2 months, earning $4 million. I'm so happy now I could jump to the moon, you know, there are plenty of handsome guys in the world. How many can get $4 million for free?" I guess my inexplicable sadness was probably because I won't be able to ride in a Lamborghini without getting dizzy later. I have money now, might as well buy one myself tomorrow. When I got home, just as I got near the entrance of the building, a figure suddenly appeared next to me. I was startled, thinking it was a thug, ready to shout for help, only to meet a pair of familiar, bright, and moist eyes. Richard, he emerged from the shadows, standing under the light and looking at me. "Sister." Indeed, his memory had returned. I looked at his reddened eyes, feeling a bit complicated. "Calvin said you were kidnapped. Were you injured?" "No, he arranged for someone to pick me up." Richard shook his head, slightly paused. "So, during that time, you cooperated with Calvin and acted like my mom, all because he promised you $3 million? I nodded. "Why?" "Because I am a shallow, vain, materialistic, and depthless woman." A gust of wind, carrying snowflakes, blew by, and I didn't want to look at his watery eyes anymore. I wrapped my coat tightly, turned and walked into the corridor. "This is your most critical year academically, go home early." Back at home, I lit a cigarette, stood by the window, and looked down. Richard was walking slowly towards the main gate of the community, his back seemed a little dejected, like an abandoned puppy. Then a familiar Lamborghini pulled up next to him. Calvin opened the car door, got out, and I couldn't make out what they were saying, but he suddenly raised his head and looked in my direction through the window. Despite the distance and the snowstorm, I had a feeling he saw me. My eyelashes trembled, I exhaled a puff of smoke, waiting for the white mist to completely dissipate in front of me before the car drove away. Before going to bed, I received a message from Calvin, "Miss Shirley, I didn't expect Richard to go see you. If he disturbed you, I apologize on his behalf." I scoffed and began to type mockingly, "Verbal apologies are boring, how about some compensation money?" Calvin didn't reply for a while, and I thought he had disgustedly blocked me. But then he sent another message, "I've never seen you spend any money. Did you want so much just to deliberately appear so vain?" His words hit a nerve, so I made a call, "Can't I just enjoy looking at it?" Every night, looking at the numbers on my bank card, I dream more confidently. "What's wrong, Calvin? You gave me the money, do you have to dictate how I spend it?" He was silent for 2 seconds, then surprisingly apologized to me, "I'm sorry. I came off as very uncultured. Don't apologize, and don't call me again." I hung up the phone and lay on the bed, somewhat despondently. During those days at their house, I wore my pilled pajamas, cheap polyester sweaters, and carried a canvas bag in and out of the villa area. I was even stopped by the security guards several times. Calvin noticed all of this. But in reality, even without Calvin's $4 million, I had saved up quite a bit over the years by working hard, burning the midnight oil writing. I just always felt it was never enough, always wanting to see the numbers on my bank card rise, making me feel secure inside. Life was tough during my school days. I had a younger brother 2 years my junior. Unlike spoiled brats made so by ignorant parents, he was intelligent and outstanding in our small county town. As a result, when it came to pocket money, it was always given to him, letting him decide how much to give me. My brother wouldn't easily give me money. During my teenage years, struggling with acne, I wanted to ask him for money to buy some cream. He would make fun of me in front of his younger friends, calling me ugly sister, laughing, and then casually taking out a banknote from his pocket and throwing it on the ground. I even reported this to my mom. She called my younger brother over, and he obediently took out money from his pocket and handed it to her, saying, "Except for the $5 that my sister is leaving, I haven't touched anything else." I know how hard it is for our parents to earn money, and I don't want to burden them further. During high school, when I stayed at the dorms and came home every weekend, my mom would give me 30 yuan, which was meant to cover my food expenses for the next week. When I went to college, the amount increased slightly to $300 a month, and I had to carefully calculate my meal card expenses down to 2 decimal places to make ends meet. I always thought that our family was poor and had limited resources. It wasn't until my younger brother failed his college entrance exam and didn't get into the university he desired that my mom took out $1,000,000 to send him to study in the UK. $1,000,000! When I cut my hair short to save money on shampoo, my brother was posting pictures on Instagram sipping coffee that cost tens of pounds in an aerial garden. It was probably from that moment that my desire for money began. I tried to earn money by taking on various part-time jobs until I found my way into writing novels and realized that I had some talent. I saved all my manuscript fees and royalties, not because I didn't want to spend them, but because I didn't see the need to. My desire for material things was actually quite low-key, I just simply liked money. When it came to love, I only dated younger people because the young changed their minds so quickly, and I just wanted to enjoy their youth without thinking about a long-term future. But these trivial matters were not worth discussing at length. I didn't want Calvin to feel sympathy for me because of them. His repeated loss of control and emotional outbursts in front of me were the best compliments I could receive. That night, I smoked half a pack of cigarettes and had many strange dreams. The scenes in the dream were indescribable. Beginning with a young handsome face that eventually transformed into Calvin. I was awakened by my phone ringing, my head pounding. I answered the call. It was my editor, informing me that a film and television company was interested in my 2 books and wanted to meet with me next week to discuss copyright matters. My drowsiness instantly disappeared, and I became wide awake. They say good news comes in pairs. Indeed, money seemed to flow towards those who didn't lack it. In the following days, I wrote at home with great enthusiasm, even turning down drinks with Jenny. But on the night before the scheduled meeting, as I finished compiling 8,000 words, someone knocked on my door. It was Richard. Despite the freezing weather outside, he was dressed lightly, his breath visible in the cold air, his fingertips red from the chill. I felt somewhat guilty towards Richard, so I ushered him inside to the warmth and asked, "Why aren't you going home at this late hour?" "Where's Calvin?" Perhaps out of habit from our prior interactions, I involuntarily softened my tone with him. Holding a cup of hot water, Richard looked up at me with emotion flickering in his eyes and said, "He's with Mia." I nodded in understanding, as they were about to become engaged. Richard was Selena's only son, Calvin's nephew, as his late sister Selena had left him the sole heir. According to the rumors within his family, Calvin had adopted Richard solely for the assets that Selena had left for her son. Family intrigues were always complex. Besides the ones involved, no one truly knew the whole truth. I sighed with a headache, admitting, "Richard, I must confess, I'm not a good person. But even if I were despicable, there are moral boundaries I wouldn't cross, especially not with a minor." "Who told you I'm a minor?" "Calvin did, right?" "He lied." Richard, looking on the verge of jumping off the sofa, frantically showed me his student ID, proving he had turned 18 a month before we met. It dawned on me suddenly. Calvin must have made me believe Richard was underage, fearing that I would try something with Richard after receiving the money and signing contracts, setting a legal trap for me. Enraged, I waited for Richard to leave before calling Calvin immediately. After several rings, he answered. Without letting him speak, I angrily exclaimed, "Calvin, you may look presentable, but your thoughts are wicked, surely? Are you a bit drunk?" His response carried a faint drunken stupor, surprising me because I knew that Calvin was not a drinker. He sheepishly confirmed that he had a bit to drink, assuming that I wouldn't mind the taste given my preference for it. Realizing that he had drunk the cheap beer I had bought in bulk and left in the villa's refrigerator, which he had never touched in front of me, made me realize that even Calvin felt nervous around Mia, just like he did with me. Not surprising for childhood sweethearts, the difference between desire and true love was like night and day. I sniffed, suppressing a hint of sadness that had crept in, and chose to remain silent, ending the call. The next day, I took a cab to the private restaurant for the meeting. The smell in the car was unbearable, making me increasingly nauseous, and I vomited against a tree trunk as soon as I stepped out. When I raised my head, I noticed a familiar deep black Lamborghini parked ahead. What a coincidence that Calvin was here today discussing business or meeting Mia. I cursed my bad luck in my heart, but as soon as I pushed open the door to the private room, I found myself locking eyes with him. Calvin was seated in the center of the room, sporting a faint smile at the corners of his lips. The editor welcomed me warmly and introduced me. "Shirley, this is Mr. Calvin from our media company. He's the one who's interested in buying the rights to your novel to develop it into a TV series." I sat down opposite Calvin, forcing a smile. "I never expected you to enjoy reading romance novels." He chuckled. "I don't particularly enjoy them, but Miss Shirley's work happens to suit my taste." I suddenly realized, so Mr. Calvin likes the type of novels I write. The editor's expression froze, and she frantically messaged me on her phone. "Are you still half asleep? Why are you antagonizing the investor like this? Are you out of your mind?" I calmed myself and flashed a pleasing smile at Calvin. We then engaged in a pleasant conversation over dinner, and by the end of the meal, Calvin promised to buy the rights to those 2 books at the highest market rate. Calculating in my mind, I found Calvin to be particularly agreeable, and I raised my glass. "Mr. Calvin, you have such great taste. Here's to a fruitful collaboration in the future." By the time I remembered that he didn't drink alcohol, Calvin had already finished a whole glass of champagne. The alcohol kicked in, giving a slight blush to his cold, pale complexion. After a brief visit to the restroom, I returned to find the table tidied up, leaving only him in the private room, eyes closed as if trying to sober up. I picked up my coat, ready to leave, but then I heard Calvin's hoarse voice from behind. "Shirley." I turned around to see him sitting in his original spot, hands intertwined on the table, gazing at me calmly. "Long time no see." I sighed and reluctantly sat back down. "Calvin, if we're here for business, why don't you cut to the chase? We were discussing work earlier, and now it's personal time." I chuckled. "Mr. Calvin, I thought our deal was already concluded." "It was, but now a new deal is starting," he said calmly. "These 2 rights will be the company's key projects for the first quarter." "So, Calvin, is that the reason you want to buy my rights? What's your motive?" Standing up, I leaned in slowly, inch by inch, getting closer to him with a smile on my lips. "Even if it's a key project, as a boss, you don't need to personally negotiate such contracts. Tell me, Mr. Calvin, why do you want to buy my rights and specially meet in person?" The sweet aroma of champagne mingled in our breaths. At such a close distance, Calvin looked into my eyes and in a cold, hoarse voice said, "Miss Shirley, you never want to be on the losing side in such matters." I huffed lightly, taking it as a compliment. "Go on." "I admit, I wanted to come see you," he said with a hint of resigned tenderness. Satisfied, I sat back down. "Calvin, you knew from the start, so I won't pretend anymore. I may be affectionate and flirtatious, but I have my own boundaries. I won't ruin someone else's marriage." He stared at me intently. "Since I'm engaged to Mia, I shouldn't be thinking about cheating. Do you wish I wouldn't marry her?" I sneered. "If I say I don't wish that, can you really not marry her? What if I said yes?" "Calvin, I'm 25, not 5. I'm not interested in continuing this pointless conversation with him, so I got up and left. That's the reason I don't want to date these older men. They are often able to lie without changing their expressions, like Calvin, who could go from a nervous state with Mia last night to making up stories about not getting engaged today for the sake of sleeping with me. At the beginning of the year, I signed the copyright contract. When the copyright fee was deposited, Jenny and I went to buy a car. Maybe because the mark of living through tough times had been deeply engraved in me, I couldn't bring myself to buy a Lamborghini. Instead, I chose a car priced just over $100,000 and also bought one for Jenny. She couldn't believe it, kept confirming, and finally hugged me tearfully in gratitude. To show her appreciation, Jenny suggested setting me up with a handsome younger brother. "How handsome is he? Do you have a photo?" I had just asked when I received a call from an unknown number. It turned out to be Richard's teacher calling, saying he had gotten into a fight at school and asked me to come over. I wanted to say that I wasn't his mother and to contact Calvin instead, but in the end, I drove to the school in my new car. Jenny waited in the car, and I hurried to the teacher's office, where I ran into Richard. With wounds on his face, he looked at me and his eyes trembled. "Sister." I sighed and began to inquire, "Why did you get into a fight?" "They insulted my mom, saying she deserved to die." When I raised my head, I noticed the complicated gaze of Richard's teacher falling on me. "Ms. Shirley, aren't you Richard's mother? Stepmother. That's how Richard addresses you. This is a private matter for us. You called me here to handle his fighting, didn't you? I impatiently said. If that's the case, let the student apologize to our Richard, and then we won't hold any grudges, and the matter will be resolved. The teacher looked at me in disbelief. Ms. Surely, Richard was the one who struck his classmate first. He gestured to a skinny boy with bruises standing nearby, along with his angry Hermes-clad mother. I know, but wasn't there a reason behind this? I reached out and pulled Richard close to me, smiled up at them, and said, "Do you both know what respect for the deceased means? Since you said such things, it's best to avoid walking alone at night in the coming years, or you might end up meeting a ghost." The lady in luxury rushed over to strike me, but I pushed her back a few steps, causing her to sit down on the ground. Then she completely lost her composure. "You promiscuous woman. You can't go a day without a man, even your stepson doesn't escape your clutches. A woman like you deserves to be drowned." I laughed, walked up to her amid her curses, squatted down, gazed at her face for a moment, then delivered a resounding slap. She couldn't believe it, so she took out her phone and cried as she called her husband. Losing patience, I stood up and looked at the stunned head teacher, saying, "There's nothing wrong, I'll take Richard back first. If there are any issues with that student and his mother, please contact Richard's dad. Richard, let's go." The kid didn't say a word, obediently following behind me. As we left the office building, I couldn't help but sigh. In the beginning, in order to pursue him, I carefully maintained the image of an elegant and intellectual big sister in front of Richard. Later, invited by Calvin to act, I also played the role of a gentle and virtuous mother. But today, all images were gone. Standing at the school gate, I turned to him and asked, "Why didn't your teacher contact Calvin?" He went with Mia to pick out the engagement ring. They plan to announce the engagement as soon as everything is ready. I admit, for a moment, I felt uncomfortable. But I quickly pushed it down. "I have something to do later. Can you go home by yourself?" He nodded obediently. "Okay, hurry back, don't wander around, there are only a few months left before the exams." As I watched Richard leave, I got into the car, holding back my anger to call Calvin. He answered. "Mr. Calvin, I know you are lovesick, but you won't die without dating a woman for a day. The engagement ring can be picked later, your fiancé won't run away." Being scolded inexplicably, my tone was at the lowest point. "Whether you're a father or an uncle, since you are Richard's guardian, please take care of him, can you?" After 2 seconds of silence, Calvin's cold voice came on. "What happened?" I rolled my eyes, call his teacher and ask. With that, I hung up the phone, turned to Jenny. She reached out to help me smooth my hair. "Don't be angry, Shirley. I'll take you to see your new boyfriend. They have a performance tonight at the Live House." "Performance?" She nodded. "Yes, actually, he's the bassist of my boyfriend's band. He's only a sophomore this year." Jenny showed me a picture, a guy with a silver wolf-tail hairstyle, wearing a choker and lip piercing. Driving all the way to the Live House entrance, I suddenly saw a very familiar figure. I looked at the exquisitely dressed Calvin in front of me, whose watch was worth 10 times more than all the tickets combined, and I almost doubted my life choices. "Mr. Calvin, you also listen to rock music?" Surrounded by a circle of rock fans, with colorful hair, flags tied on their heads, and wearing cultural shirts, the sound of drums from the rehearsal venue could faintly be heard. Calvin seemed unaware of his incongruity, just nodding slightly, yes. Jenny looked at me hesitantly. I waved at her. "It's okay, go backstage first, I'll be there later." After Jenny left, Calvin put his hand in his pocket and handed me the phone. "You didn't hang up." My brow twitched, subconsciously saying, "I didn't mean to." I know, Calvin's tone paused slightly, still as calm as ever, but I seemed to sense an undercurrent beneath the ice, but I did it on purpose. Feeling something coming, my throat tightened, I swallowed hard, forcibly changing the topic. "Did you contact Richard's teacher?" "I called on the way here." "Then he should have told you, I hit Richard's classmate's mom." He nodded. "It's okay, I'll deal with it. But now I came to talk to you about something between us." Failing to change the topic, the conversation still returned to us. Calvin looked straight at me. Even though I know you didn't hang up on purpose, I came immediately. Surely, you should know the reason. I know, that's why I coldly smiled. Last time, did I not make it clear enough? Calvin, I can't compete with you old men. Since you've already gone to pick out the engagement ring, why are you still bothering me? Suddenly, he stepped forward, put his arms around me, and planted a warm kiss on my ear. Before I could struggle, Calvin spoke. I did go to pick out the engagement ring, but not with someone. I went alone. My attempt to push him away stopped. I struggled to say, even so, that day you went on a date with Mia and drank because you were nervous. A date? Calvin's tone was puzzled. I haven't seen her in a long time. I did drink because I was nervous, but that was because I had to meet you the next day. I immediately realized Richard, at such a young age, was already so scheming. The embrace lasted for a long time, the warmth gradually transferring between us. Even the night wind blowing past us was no longer as chilly as a winter's day. As Calvin held me by the back of my head and leaned in for a kiss, I suddenly realized that spring had arrived. In the nearby venue, the song Love of My Life by Queen was playing. After 3 months, I once again sat in the luxurious car without feeling carsick. I sent a message to Jenny, then turned to Calvin, our eyes meeting. I said, "Don't disturb Richard's studies, come to my house." Calvin smiled, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You seem to care for him." I chuckled. "Is it me who cares for him? Or is it you? The first few times, as soon as you saw your son, you pushed me away. I thought you were avoiding suspicion." Calvin pursed his lips, staying silent. "Who said he wasn't interested in his son's girlfriend?" I pressed on. He leaned in suddenly, giving me a kiss on the lips, and holding up his hands in surrender. "I give up." Then he drove me to another one of his properties. It was also a villa, a bit remote, but with a glass house in the yard, inside which there was a hot spring. The room was dimly lit, the moonlight mixed with the night breeze, swaying the light gauze at the window. Calvin wrapped me in his arms, and the kisses fell gently and densely, the atmosphere gradually turning ambiguous. Suddenly, I remembered something, pushed him away abruptly, sprang up and grabbed my phone from the table. "What's wrong?" Calvin's voice carried a tone of unsatisfied hoarseness. In the draft box, there was no draft. I hadn't updated yet today, risking losing the full attendance bonus of 600 yuan for the month. Familiar with the operations, I copied and posted the new chapter, then put down my phone and returned to Calvin's side. His originally cold eyes, akin to snow-covered mountains, now bore a hint of softness, though the turbulent undercurrent had not completely subsided. He sounded somewhat displeased. "Am I not worth 600 yuan to you?" "The nature is different, Calvin. Don't objectify yourself." I cradled his face, smiling as I kissed him. "Fine, I'll let you win this game," I teased. His awkwardness felt abnormal, sparking my suspicions. Calvin stared into my eyes and spoke softly. "Sorry, I don't know how." I blinked. "You've never been in a relationship before?" "No." Calvin pursed his lips, then suddenly leaned down to kiss me, the tone incredibly light, almost coquettish. "Surely, come, teach me." It turned out that someone with extraordinary business acumen would not be too shabby in other aspects. The rain tapped lightly against the window, stopping shortly after midnight, with the moonlight peeking through the clouds. The next morning, I woke up to the sweet smell of toast wafting up from downstairs. Calvin was in the kitchen, making breakfast. I descended the stairs in slippers. "Actually, I like toast with jam for breakfast," I mentioned. He plated the sandwich and pushed it towards me. "I'll get you one next time." Back when I lived with his house, I used to cook porridge for Richard in the evenings, insisting he ate lighter meals. After he fell asleep, I would sneak out to the nearby convenience store to buy snacks, dressed too casually one time that the security guard stopped me at the gate. I had to call Calvin to come out and pick me up. On the way back, Calvin's expression was cold, maybe cut down on eating unhealthy stuff too. Obviously, Calvin remembered, squinting as he approached me. "Still bearing a grudge?" "Good memory, can't help it." He huffed and suddenly lifted me onto the nearby stone dining table. The cold, hard surface made me apprehensive. He cleared his throat and started revisiting old issues in a deliberate manner. Some say she doesn't date older men because they lack stamina due to their age. Trapped in his embrace, I playfully nudged his knee with my toe. Exactly, that's how I feel now. I soon regretted those words. Later that evening, with my aching back, I met Jenny. She inquired, "So, did you really have a real affair with that old man?" "Yes, really." Jenny, worldly-wise, sighed, "But the class difference is too big, it may not last." "Who said I'm looking for something long-term with him?" I picked up a glass, took a sip, just like before, it was just a love affair, living day by day. "Really?" Jenny seemed hesitant. "I thought you really fell for him." "I did. Falling for someone doesn't mean I can tie my future to another person without any reservations, betting on their loyalty and devotion." I think Calvin shares my thoughts on this, so we both silently kept the relationship from Richard. The progress on copyright development went smoothly, leading to an increase in interaction between us. We discussed work during the day and shared love stories at night. With less than 2 months left before the college entrance exam, the house I purchased was successfully handed over. As it was fully furnished, I bought a few pieces of furniture and appliances before moving in. Calvin came to help me move. Stepping inside, he glanced around and commented, "It's a bit small. Couldn't you afford a larger one?" I retorted, "It's enough for me. Would you like to continue financing me if you find it too cramped here?" Calvin fixed his gaze on me. "Of course." I raised an eyebrow, jokingly, "For me, this place is perfectly fine. If you're not happy with the size, we can move elsewhere in the future." In the following week, Calvin stayed at my place every day. To the extent that Richard grew suspicious and called, "Why haven't you returned home these days?" Calvin remained composed, calmly lying, working late at the office. His fingers lingered on the mole at my waist, a gesture signaling a lie. As I recalled the first time we met when he used the same tone to tell me about Richard being just 16. It was a lie. I'm not one to spoil the atmosphere, so I didn't expect Richard to bring up the subject first. "I thought you would ask me about Richard." The tense moment of ambiguity dissolved. I sighed, poured myself a glass of water, and said, "There's nothing to ask. From the information available, we can already deduce a lot. Richard had a philandering father and a helpless mother. Calvin seems to have a good relationship with Selena. So, after her passing, he took Richard under his wing. It was on the day of the house inspection that I rarely posted a social media update and received a call from my mom that night. "You bought a house? Why didn't you tell the family?" I had blocked them, but some distant relative must have seen it and passed on the news. "Would it make a difference if I told you?" I coldly remarked, "Yes, I bought a house. Still short on money for furnishing it. Can you and Dad chip in?" My mom hung up immediately. Ever since my brother went to study in the UK, I hadn't returned home. My relationship with my mom was already lukewarm, but now, we didn't even communicate for over a year. Even during the Chinese New Year, I spent it with Jenny. Surely. I snapped back to reality, seeing Calvin standing in front of me. He kissed away the water droplets on my lips, whispering, "You never told me about your family." There is not much to say. I put down the water glass and raised my face to meet their gaze. "Just treat me like Richard, both parents are gone, that's all." It seems like every time I raise a flag, I get slapped in the face soon after. The next afternoon, I was typing at home when the doorbell suddenly rang. I thought it was Calvin coming back early, but when I opened the door, I saw 3 familiar figures. My dad, my mom, and my younger brother. "How did you find this place?" I frowned, ready to close the door, but my brother reached out and stopped it with his hand. "Sis, you exposed the neighborhood with your own photos, you can't blame us. As for which specific unit, why not ask the property management? We are your family after all." The 3 of them walked in without even changing their shoes, looked around, and nodded in satisfaction. "Not bad, not bad, although it's small, it's enough for a bridal room." My mom looked at me. "Surely, we have introduced a girl to your brother. The girl insists on having a house in a big city before continuing to talk. You need to vacate your house." I stared at her defiant expression and suddenly laughed. Get married? He embezzled so much money from the company, shouldn't he be in jail by now? My brother's little cleverness was useful when dealing with me in childhood, but now it's not enough. Last year, he graduated and returned to the country, relying on his British degree. He found a decent job in finance. But due to his foolishness, he embezzled money from the company to invest in stocks and lost everything. The hole couldn't be filled. The other party wanted to sue him. My parents were left with nothing, had to seek help everywhere, and finally managed to keep him out of prison. But our family was now destitute. My brother lost his job, and his reputation in the circle was ruined. This year, they seem to have resigned themselves to fate, planning to get him married and have a child as soon as possible, and now they have set their eyes on me. Listening to what I said, my mom flew into a rage, rushed over, and tried to slap me. I grabbed her wrist as she was about to hit me and stared at her. Take your son and get out of my house. Otherwise, I'll call the police. As I took out my phone to dial, my brother slapped my phone out of my hand and stepped on it. Call the police? What are you going to report? Sister, we are family. Do you think the police will care about these things? Do you think Dad will care about these things? Do you think Mom will take your side? For many years, I had lived under this shadow, and if my mental resilience hadn't been strong enough, I would have been driven into mental problems by them long ago. Staring at his sinister face, the last strand of rationality in my mind snapped. My brother let out a miserable scream, covering his nose and stepping back, blood streaming down. It was because I had punched him in the face. My mom screamed and pounced on me. My dad and brother quickly joined in. The three of them began beating me up in the house I bought. A sharp tearing pain in my eye sockets, some hot liquid flowing down, dripping on the corner of my lips. In the chaos, I seemed to hear a faint sound of the door opening. Then Calvin's voice, icy cold and filled with anger. Shirley. The force pressing on me suddenly lightened. Through the blurred vision caused by blood, I saw him grab my brother and push him onto the sofa, punching him hard a few times. My dad and mom's strength was enough against me, but they couldn't stop Calvin's fists in any way. Seeing that he was about to hit again, I gently called out, Calvin, take me to the hospital. As he loosened his grip, my dad and mom helped their beloved son up and scurried away. Calvin knelt in front of me, reaching out to touch my face. His fingertips were trembling. Shirley. The intense pain made it almost impossible for me to think, so I struggled to maintain some semblance of composure and forced out a smile. Sorry for the poor hospitality, making you witness such a scene. He didn't say anything, just picked me up from the ground, put me in the car, and drove straight to the hospital. It was embarrassing for Calvin to see such a thing just a few months into our relationship. While cleaning up my wounds at the hospital, I was desperately trying to add, I just bought that sofa, it was quite expensive, and got dirty so soon. I'll replace it. If there's nothing else, you should go home. I feel like the wound is not too serious. Richard is going to take the college entrance exam soon, so I called Jenny. Shirley, be quiet. Calvin's tone was furious to the extreme, and I kept my basic vigilance against danger and quickly shut up. The doctor used a cotton ball to clean the blood smeared over half my face, revealing the wounds. There were some miscellaneous scratches, a few soft tissue injuries, and the most severe was a 2-centimeter tear extending from the corner of my eye to my temple. The doctor said, it seems to be a metal scratch. With the hot weather, it might scar. Calvin looked solemn. I had never seen him show such an expression even when his company's stock prices plummeted. He had the doctor treat my wound, while he went to the side to call his lawyer, saying he wanted an injury assessment and then prepare the lawsuit materials. After everything was taken care of, the doctor also left, leaving only me and him in the hospital room. Under the bright incandescent light, he came up to me, sat down by the bed, and gently held my cold hand in his warm palm. My fingertips were icy, while his palm was blazing. I kept my eyes down, smiled slightly. We've been together for such a short time, and you've already seen this mess. It's quite embarrassing, isn't it? People like Calvin were the most rational and clear-minded. Once he sensed some unavoidable trouble, he would make the most decisive choice. I was waiting for him to say we should break up, or use a more dignified way of expressing it, but what I got was a hug. Perhaps considering the wounds on my body, he hugged me lightly, but his voice in my ear carried a power as powerful as a thunderbolt. Surely, this is not humiliating. No one chooses their family of birth, becoming family with them is your misfortune, but it's not humiliating. A lump seemed to be stuck in my throat, I couldn't make any sound, so I slowly, bit by bit, raised my hand to hug him back. I felt myself trembling, tears wetting my eyes, soaking the gauze on the wound on my face, stinging it. For so many years, I had been trying my best to sever my ties with them. Except for Jenny, I hadn't told anyone about my family. I did really well also. Some people even envy me and say, "You have such a good personality, you're so relaxed every day, you and your family must be very happy." Right? Surely, you don't know how to love at all. What you think is love, is just flirting. I refuse to admit defeat. Do you? Calvin shook his head, holding my hand and gently pressing it against his cheek, gazing into my eyes. No, I don't. So, let's learn it together. Because the bandage was soaked through with tears, the doctor had to come and reapply it. He sternly warned us, if this continues, you'll end up with scars. Calvin pursed his lips to apologize. I, in my recklessness, asked the doctor, "Can we smoke and drink?" "Of course not. Do you really want to ruin your appearance?" the doctor bluntly said, and added, "And for the next period, your diet must be light." Just because of this, Calvin suggested that I go back to the villa so that all 3 meals could strictly follow the doctor's orders. What about Richard? He's taking the college entrance exam next month. Don't worry about him. Calvin drove and calmly said, "In urgent matters, one must act accordingly. He needs to handle his own academic and future prospects sensibly. Moreover, now that your family already knows your address, it's better to avoid them until the lawyer files the lawsuit." I have to admit, Calvin is quite reasonable in what he says. So, after being discharged from the hospital, I packed up 2 suitcases and moved into the villa. This second time moving in, I was already quite familiar with it. One evening, I was sitting at the table drinking millet congee when Richard returned from school. He saw me, paused for a moment, then strode over and stood in front of me. His gaze fell on the bandage at the corner of my eye and the purple bruise on my cheek. The child's eyes suddenly turned cold. "How did you get injured?" "I was bitten by a mad dog." I lifted my hand, subconsciously wanting to pat the head of the elder son. Calvin came out with a plate of cut fruits and coldly snorted beside us. Suddenly realizing this was no longer the time for acting as before, I silently lowered my hand. "It's nothing. The doctor said healing properly will be enough." Richard sat down in front of me, staring at the wound on my face with concern. After a moment of thought, I asked him, "When I hit the mother of your classmate last time, did he stop bothering you afterward?" He shook his head. "Sister, I'm fine, you can relax." Richard. Calvin walked over, tapped the table with his finger, and said, "Go study." Richard hesitated, slowly got up, stared into Calvin's eyes, and said word by word, "Got it, uncle." The young man in his puberty grows quickly, already nearly as tall as Calvin when standing, just a bit more slender in bone structure and posture. Finally, Richard went upstairs to study. Calvin sat across from me, picked up a piece of pear, and brought it to my lips. I took a bite and looked at the remaining hint of coldness on his face, then smiled slightly. "Calvin, are you jealous?" He just stared at me, saying nothing. Suddenly I remembered my face now resembled a color palette. "Sorry, I got used to it." "Do I look pretty ugly smiling like this now?" Calvin shook his head, held my hand on the table, pressed it against his cheek. He said hoarsely, "Not ugly. I find you more attractive than before." Staring into his eyes, clear as spring water in a mountain stream, incredibly pure. My heart began to beat faster involuntarily. I pulled back my hand, stood up. "I'm going to take a shower." As a result, as I hid on the balcony and took out my cigarette case, a hand reached out from behind and took it away. Calvin calmly said, "I knew it." I sighed. "What about your engagement with Mia?" They only mentioned a marriage alliance with our family without specifying a specific individual. Besides, I've separated the company from the family 5 years ago. Calvin casually put my pack of cigarettes into his pocket, ignoring my eyes pleading for mercy. "I haven't seen Mia for a long time, nor will I have anything to do with her in the future. But I saw you with her when you were out shopping at Hermes before." Calvin turned to look at me, his eyes showing something more. "Not with her, it was acting for my older brother and sister-in-law, and nothing more." He suddenly grabbed my wrist, led me to the bedroom, then pulled out a Hermes orange bag from the closet. Calvin handed me the bag. I opened it and found a cream-colored handbag inside. He looked at me, the emotions in his eyes like an invisible mist, completely enveloping me without reservation. That day when I went to the bar to find you, I saw that your bag was torn, so I bought you a new one. I haven't decided when to give it to you. He was referring to my worn-out canvas bag. I never owned that bag, but when researching for my novel, I found out that its price was higher than that of my car. I stared into Calvin's eyes, and suddenly 5 words popped into my mind: he is serious. In early June, the TV drama adapted from my novel officially began filming. Calvin and I attended the opening ceremony. After leaving, he received a phone call and went back to the company. I was planning to go find Jenny, but I was stopped by a familiar yet unfamiliar woman. Mia, holding that golden brown Hermes bag, smiled elegantly at me. Miss Shirley, there's a cafe nearby. Shall we go for a drink? No need, I sighed. Cafes are risky. Either I'll spill on you, or you'll spill on me. I've written this plot hundreds of times, so if you have something to say it here. Her expression froze. After a moment, she put away her smile, crossed her arms, and looked at me coldly. Miss Shirley, you are a smart person. I hope you can show some respect. The merging of our two families is a win-win situation, beneficial for Calvin's business. If you really love him, you should consider his well-being. I don't love him. I love money, so I want to be with him, to try to get his money. I intentionally waved the bag Calvin gave me in front of her, watching her face turn white with anger. Unless you can offer a higher price, please leave. Later that evening, when Calvin came back, he played a recording on his phone in front of me. It was my voice saying, I don't love him. I love money, so I want to be with him, to try to get his money. He turned off the recorder and looked at me. I was furious. You rich people are really dirty in your tactics. Calvin raised a corner of his lip and asked, do you really love money that much? Before I could say anything, he turned around and took out a document from the bookshelf, handing it to me. This is for you. What do you think? I glanced at it and realized it was a gift contract for the hot spring villa. Was I dreaming? I took a deep breath, closed the contract, and looked up at him. What is this? Severance pay? A cold look flashed in Calvin's eyes. Just a small gift. I fell silent and stared straight at Calvin until he uncomfortably turned his head and spoke softly. What's wrong? 2 days later, it was finally Richard's college entrance exam. Calvin and I stood outside the examination room, waiting. Calvin held an umbrella to shield me from the sun. After Richard finished his last exam, a group of kids cheered and rushed out. Richard was surrounded by his classmates, shouting about going to KTV to sing all night. Go ahead, have fun, I said with a smile. You've finished the exams, it's time to relax and have some fun. Sister, Richard looked at me, his eyes reflecting an emotion that I couldn't quite decipher. On the way back home, Calvin kept his jaw clenched, silent, seeming a bit angry. In the spacious villa, only the two of us were present. Calvin came to change the bandage on the wound at the corner of my eye, his warm fingertips tracing down my cheekbone. And then everything predictably spiraled out of control. Even the lights in the living room were still on. I struggled a bit and said, Calvin, let's go to the bedroom. He slightly propped himself up and gazed at me, saying, no. Suddenly, I felt like this conversation was familiar, as if it had happened 6 months ago, only with the positions reversed. It was at that moment that the villa's front door was pushed open. Calvin seemed oblivious and continued to kiss me. Along with the familiar woody scent that emanated from him, his lips merged with mine, blending into my breath. Calvin! Richard rushed over, angrily pulling Calvin away from me. You took advantage of her. You did it on purpose. I'm already of legal age. Why did you lie to Shirley and say I'm 16? Calvin frowned slightly, withdrawing his arm from mine, straightening the shirt I had wrinkled. He then looked at Richard nonchalantly. Didn't you lie to her too? When did I have a date with Mia, and when did I go ring shopping with Mia? The initially noble and aloof demeanor returned to him. I suddenly realized that this side of Calvin was quite confrontational. Richard's eyes flickered, unable to retort, and gritted his teeth. Even so, now that I've finished the exams, I'm already of legal age. I want to compete with you fair and square, Calvin sneered. You don't stand a chance. Richard's eyes reddened. I knew her first. Being first or second doesn't mean anything, especially since I can offer her everything you can, and you had impure motives from the beginning. You dare to say that I mistook her from the start, yet you paid her to stay, all part of your scheme, right? Even orchestrating my kidnapping, you had it all planned out in advance, sending people to assist me. Shirley and I are just your pawns. Calvin looked at him coldly. Richard, you better understand, I took care of you not because I coveted your meager shares, but because your mother entrusted you to me. I may not be a good person, but I have a clear conscience in raising you. Richard's eyes turned even redder. His lips trembled twice, but he didn't say anything before turning and going upstairs. Calvin then turned to me and looked down. I stared back expressionless. You did it on purpose. After 2 seconds of silence, he replied, yes. Calvin, what is this all about? He suddenly knelt in front of me, gently holding my hand. The question you asked me that day, I can answer it now. Yes, I was jealous. Jealous that Richard met you first, jealous that you and he had been together, even for just a day, jealous that you kissed him. I had only kissed Richard once, on the evening we confirmed our relationship, under a street lamp. It was just a light touch, yet he even blushed at that. The question was, how did Calvin know about it? During that time, Richard was constantly sneaking out, and worried about possible schemes from my brother and sister-in-law. I followed him in a car. So when Richard and I kissed, Calvin was watching from the car next to us. I remained silent for a while before asking, Richard said you were setting up something. What exactly is it? Before my sister passed away, she left all her shares to Richard under my care. Many people in the family coveted these shares, so after several negotiations, we agreed that once Richard finished his college entrance exams, the shares would be entirely transferred to him. But if I got married before that, I could officially proceed with the adoption process, and whether the shares would be returned to him by then would be entirely up to me. When my brother and sister-in-law saw me bringing you back, and saw Richard's approval of you, they were afraid they wouldn't have another chance to take advantage. That's why they had him abducted. I see. I fell silent, and the living room fell into quiet. Calvin's gaze gradually revealed a hint of panic and helplessness. Surely, coming back to my senses, I asked, what about now? He said, now. Pausing for a moment, he took out a small box from his pocket. Opening it, the diamond sparkled on the black velvet. You see, I had already selected the engagement ring before going to see you that day. Surely, perhaps, would you be willing to marry me? I knocked on Richard's door, but there was no response. So I pushed the door and walked in. He didn't fall asleep after all, holding a can of beer, standing somewhat desolately on the balcony lost in thought. Richard. He turned around and saw me, his eyelashes trembled, sister. I sighed, stood next to him, and apologized, sorry. In the end, this is my fault. I initiated flirting with you, and then, tempted by the price Calvin offered, I agreed to act for him. Sister, I don't blame you. Richard pursed his lips. I don't blame my uncle either, I know. His own company is not inferior to the family business at all. My small share doesn't matter. I just don't know what to do now. It feels like I was in a car accident, had a period of memory loss, and then messed everything up. He looked at me, his eyes misty, as if he had been crying. So, sister, it's because I'm so worthless that I can't compare to my uncle in any way, that you would be with him, right? Of course not. I spoke without hesitation. I am with him because I love him. As the words came out, I was stunned. Do I love Calvin? Has my initial fleeting attraction to him unknowingly grown to this extent? This natural and spontaneous confession left me feeling confused and scared. I see. Richard's voice had a hint of a sob. It's getting late, sister, you should go back and rest early. I walked to the door in a daze. As it closed behind me, I heard Richard's voice from inside the room. With a hoarse after-crying tone, even so, I will always like you, Shirley. The door closed. I stood still for a moment, then returned to the bedroom. Calvin was sitting at the table, flipping through a book, looking very calm, even indifferent, showing no sign of just being rejected from his proposal. That was enough to gradually calm down my restless heart. I walked up to him, and when Calvin heard the movement, he looked up, have you finished talking with him? I nodded. The lawyer called yesterday, saying the lawsuit against my parents and my brother is underway, and my injuries are almost healed. I think I can move back tomorrow. Calvin's reaction was intense. He suddenly stood up and stared into my eyes, word by word. What did you say? I collected my thoughts. Calvin, I think we are just. Before I could finish the sentence, he silenced me with his lips. In a hushed tone between my lips, he murmured with a strange resentment, so is this why you refused my proposal? Do you want to reconsider our relationship? What is he saying? I pushed Calvin away forcefully, took a step back, and stared at him. It's because you acted so calmly. I thought your proposal was just casual. And being rejected didn't matter to you. Does anyone propose casually? He coldly stared at me. Then why did you propose to me? Calvin closed his eyes for a moment, then, as if determined, said, because I love you. Surely, I love you, so I want to marry you. It was as if fireworks exploded in my mind for a moment. I stared blankly at Calvin in front of me until he lowered his head and kissed me, and I still hadn't reacted. But our bodies were already familiar with each other and began to respond instinctively. The kiss lasted for a long time before ending. He rested his forehead against mine, breathing heavily, quite cunning, surely. Always making me say it first. Who asked you to remain so calm after being rejected in your proposal? I refused to admit, raising my chin, maybe saying those words now is just another way to deceive me. Calvin smirked, his hand slid down, gripping my waist and pushing forward, resignedly saying, I just wanted to act as if nothing happened, to avoid pressuring you, and then just run away, hoping for another chance to propose later. You are quite conniving, Calvin. I couldn't help but smile and wink at him. Then why don't you propose again now, and see what happens? And when Calvin obediently knelt down again, I reached out my hand to him. All right, let's get married. Later, Calvin took me to pick a wedding dress. Coming out of the dressing room, I saw him pursing his lips, staring at his phone screen, looking somewhat cold. What's wrong? I tried to look over, but he put away his phone. It's nothing, just a small matter. I promise it will be resolved before tonight. Surely, focus on trying on wedding dresses. I nodded without saying anything more. I had already seen that Mia, the unrepentant thief, had once again approached my resentful mother. They were spreading rumors online together, probably trying to follow my father and brother to prison for a family reunion dinner. I refocused my thoughts and looked at myself in the mirror. A long time ago, during my university days, I had worked part-time at a bridal shop. One day, when there were few customers, the store manager urged us all to try on wedding dresses, saying that every girl has dreamed of wearing a white dress and marrying the one they love. I smiled back then, declined to try on the dress, and just said, I never thought about it. My only dream is to earn a lot of money, so much that it can't be spent. However, after many years, I actually had more money than I could spend, and I also had someone I wanted to marry. I took 2 steps forward and looked at myself in the mirror. The fishtail wedding dress was adorned with diamonds. Calvin walked over, wearing a suit, and stood next to me, his long fingers gently wrapping around my waist. Indeed, the white dress looked very beautiful.